This is about the last half or so of Chapter 9 of Pauline Kael, A Life in the Dark, by Brian Kellow. Pauline was distressed that the creative ferment that had burst out of France and Britain at the end of the 50s seemed to have dried up. It was particularly sad to see what had happened to Francois Truffaut, who had taken on the ill-advised Fahrenheit 451 and was now preparing what would turn out to be a hollow parody of his idol, Alfred Hitchcock, The Bride Wore Black. One of the few French directors to keep his hold was Jean-Luc Godard, whose Band of Outsiders Pauline had admired. She felt that Breathless and Band of Outsiders derived their spark from the fact that they were movies made by a generation bred on movies. Godard is the Scott Fitzgerald of the movie world, and movies are, for the 60s, a synthesis of what the arts were for the post-World War I generation. Rebellion, romance, a new style of life. Unfortunately, Band of Outsiders failed to intrigue American audiences and played in New York for only a single week in March 1966. American movies, Pauline believed, were in a shambles. She was certain that she had been right about the dangerous example set by The Sound of Music. Big, expensive, self-important pictures seemed to be all that interested the studios. Very seldom did she see anything that reflected the current climate in America in a serious or challenging way, and she had come to fear that perhaps there wasn't even a public for such movies. Impressed as she had been by Truffaut's and Godard's early films, she had stopped short of genuine capitulation to them. That degree of abandon she still reserved for an American movie. And then, on August 4th, 1967, Bonnie and Clyde opened at the Montreal Film Festival. The picture had first gone into development in 1963, when David Newman and Robert Benton, both staff art directors at Esquire, had gotten together to write a treatment based on the legendary Depression-era crime sprees of Clyde Barrow and Bonnie Parker. Like Pauline, Newman and Benton were impatient for the American film to move forward, and their telling of the story of Bonnie and Clyde showed the influence of the French New Wave filmmakers. When it was released, it was clear that the restless, often violent spirit of the 60s pervaded practically every frame of the movie. Versions of the story of Bonnie and Clyde had reached the screen many times before, in Fritz Lang's You Only Live Twice, 1937, and Joseph H. Lewis's Gun Crazy, 1950, among others, but never with such complexity, such wit, such unexpected shifts of tone, the wild, jaunty scenes of the early part of the picture leading seamlessly into the more violent and disturbing second half. Warren Beatty's Clyde and Faye Dunaway's Bonnie were so vital and attractive that it was easy for those watching the movie to accept them as folk heroes. The film seemed to embrace them as stand-ins for all those disenfranchised by the worst economic disaster in U.S. history, and the audience wanted them to get away with everything. There was a remarkable scene midway through the picture in which Bonnie and Clyde shoot up a house that has been repossessed by the bank, and with the fervor of a student protester, the owner joins them in shooting out the windows and the bank's sign. In the horrifying finale, the couple dies in a shower of bullets, agonizingly and yet somehow beautifully, in a staggering orgy of violence. This was tough stuff for audiences at the time, but the director, Arthur Penn, and Beatty gambled that contemporary moviegoers would connect with what was happening on the screen. At first it appeared that their gamble might fizzle. Warner's opened Bonnie and Clyde in a string of mostly undistinguished theaters in mid-August 1967. Some of the reviews, from Judith Crist and a few others, were positive, but many of the most important ones were not, and the most important one of all was, of course, written by Pauline's bête-noire, Bosley Crowther, in the New York Times. Long known for his abhorrence of violence, Crowther found the portrayal of Bonnie and Clyde nothing less than an act of moral repugnance. He denounced the film as a cheap piece of bald-faced slapstick comedy that treats the hideous depredation of that sleazy, moronic pair as though they were as full of fun and frolic as the jazz-age cut-ups in Thoroughly Modern Millie. From the moment she saw Bonnie and Clyde, Pauline was one of the film's most enthusiastic champions. It excited her as no movie had in years. If a picture as thrillingly bold and original as Bonnie and Clyde could come out of a climate that was desperate to create another Sound of Music or Dr. Zhivago, there might yet be amazing possibilities in store for the American movies. The trouble was, she had not had an opportunity to write about it. She had submitted a lengthy essay to the New Republic during the month that she departed from the magazine, but the editors considered it overlong and refused to run it. There was one place where length would not be an issue, the New Yorker. The magazine had already featured Penelope Gilliatt's very favorable notice, but Pauline knew that the magazine's editor, William Shawn, had been following her work for some years. Shawn was a serious moviegoer, and he had been particularly intrigued by Pauline's writings on Godard in The New Republic. She had already made her New Yorker debut in the June 3, 1967 issue with an article entitled Movies on Television, in which she discussed the mixed blessing of re-encountering old films on the small screen. Robert Mills now called William Shawn with an offer. Would he be interested in publishing a 7,000-word essay on why Bonnie and Clyde represented a moment of enormous importance in America's pop culture? In terms of the impact it would have on her career, it was the most important essay Pauline would ever write. It ran in the New Yorker's issue of October 21, 1967, and it opened on a strong note of defiance in one of her favorite devices, the rhetorical question. Quote, "How do you make a good movie in this country without being jumped on? Bonnie and Clyde is the most excitingly American movie since The Manchurian Candidate. The audience is alive to it. Our experience, as we watch it, has some connection with the way we reacted to movies in childhood, with how we came to love them and to feel they were ours, not an art that we learned over the years to appreciate, but simply and immediately ours. When an American movie is contemporary in feeling, like this one, it makes a different kind of contact with an American audience from the kind that is made by European films, however contemporary. Yet any movie that is contemporary in feeling is likely to go further than other movies, go too far for some tastes, and Bonnie and Clyde divides audiences, as The Manchurian Candidate did, and it is being jumped on almost as hard." End quote. She felt that the screenwriters had tapped into something very important, in that they were able to use the knowledge that, like many of our other famous outlaws and gangsters, the real Bonnie and Clyde seemed to others to be acting out forbidden roles, and to relish their roles. In contrast with secret criminals, the furtive embezzlers and other crooks who lead seemingly honest lives, the known outlaws capture the public imagination, because they take chances, and because, often, they enjoy dramatizing their lives. She could tell from the vibe in the theater that Bonnie and Clyde keeps the audience in a kind of eager, nervous imbalance, holds our attention by throwing our disbelief back in our faces. To be put on is to be put on the spot, made the stooge in a comedy act. People in the audience at Bonnie and Clyde are laughing, demonstrating that they're not stooges, that they appreciate the joke, when they catch the first bullet right in the face. In a sense, Bonnie and Clyde played the audience in a way that wasn't unlike the way Hitchcock had been playing them for years. But it did so with a cleanness and open-heartedness that Hitchcock could never come near. Part of the genius of Penn's direction had such sleight of hand. He was driving the vehicle, but both hands weren't clenched fiercely on the steering wheel. Audiences at Bonnie and Clyde are not given a simple, secure basis for identification, Pauline wrote. They are made to feel, but are not told how to feel. One of the ways that Bonnie and Clyde ushered in a new era in American movie-making was with its stunningly direct portrayal of violence and its effect on our lives. Accusing the film of romanticizing crime and promoting violence was an easy, facile way of attacking it, and many critics and columnists had taken it. Arthur Penn objected to this in a New York Times interview that appeared a few weeks after the movie's release. The trouble with the violence in most films, he said, is that it is not violent enough. A war film that doesn't show the real horrors of war, bodies being torn apart and arms being shot off, really glorifies war. Pauline agreed, writing that, "The whole point of Bonnie and Clyde is to rub our noses in it, to make us pay our dues for laughing. The dirty reality of death, not suggestions, but blood and holes, is necessary. Bonnie and Clyde needs violence. Violence is its meaning." And she cautioned against people who saw Bonnie and Clyde as a danger to public morality. They think an audience goes to a play or a movie and takes the actions in it as examples for imitation. They look at the world and blame the movies. Bonnie and Clyde had done contemporary audiences a favor, she felt, because it has put the sting back into death. At last it seemed that the American film might be on its way to growing up, as she had longed for it to do for decades. The ultimate cinematic seduction she had dreamed of for so long might now actually be on the verge of happening. Pauline's review did not, as it was often claimed, turn around Bonnie and Clyde's fortunes single-handedly. The movie had been doing well in its single-theater bookings in a number of major U.S. cities, but Warner Brothers had never put much promotional muscle behind it, and by mid-October it was being yanked from theaters to make way for the studio's new release, Reflections in a Golden Eye, starring Marlon Brando and Elizabeth Taylor. But the fascination with Bonnie and Clyde continued, and in December, Time ran a lengthy cover story about the movie's impact on the culture. Early in 1968, Warren Beatty strong-armed Warners into giving the picture a well-orchestrated re-release, and this time there were long lines at the box office everywhere. It was nominated for 10 Academy Awards, including Best Picture, in competition with another of the year's trend-setting films, Mike Nichols' The Graduate. Both lost to the much tamer In the Heat of the Night, but even that, via its exploration of racial tensions in a Mississippi murder case, was indicative of a changing Hollywood. The management of the New York Times, meanwhile, had taken note of the movie's resonance and decided that the time had come for their chief film critic to step down, and December of 1967 marked the end of Bosley Crowther's 22-year reign. He continued on staff for a time as a special reporter, but he was devastated that the success of Bonnie and Clyde had unseated him from the powerful position he had held for so long. In an act of counterpoint so perfect it might have come out of an old movie, Pauline's fortunes rose at the precise moment that those of her old nemesis collapsed. She had been out of work since the New Yorker's piece on Bonnie and Clyde had run, and with the holidays approaching, she was in bed with the flu. Uncharacteristically for her, she had sunk into a state of dejection and self-pity. The irony of her situation seemed particularly nasty. Just as the movies were showing signs of having the dust blown out of them, she seemed further than ever from her dream of making a living as a film critic. For weeks, William Shawn had been pondering over some of the points Pauline had raised in her essay on Bonnie and Clyde. The New Yorker had a long history of movie critics who traded in light, above-it-all dismissals of the pictures they reviewed, a school of criticism that owed much more to the brittle wit of a Dorothy Parker than to the searching curiosity of a James Agee. John McCartan, particularly, had represented this school of criticism, peering at the movies he covered as imperiously as Eustace Tilley, the magazine's icon, peered through his monocle. Shawn decided that a different approach was needed. He wanted someone in tune with the way movies were now, who could speak to the rabid, movie-loving audience that had come along in the last decade. Pauline's piece on Bonnie and Clyde had been a test, and she had passed. Shawn phoned her and told her that he wanted her to succeed Brendan Gill as movie critic for 6 months a year, alternating with Penelope Gilliatt. She was to begin in January. It is tempting, however wrongly, for those of us examining the lives of writers, actors, and other artists of the mid-20th century, to see those lives unfold with the rhythm and pace of an old-fashioned 3-act Broadway play. Act 1 entails the long, slow study and preparation for a brilliant career. Act 2, the vintage years of that career. Act 3, the inevitable decline to the end. Pauline's Act 1 had lasted an unusually long time. At age 48, her prolonged apprenticeship was finally completed. What she felt now was the opposite of stage fright. It was an inability to remain standing in the wings any longer, a driving urgency to make her entrance and get on with the best part of the play. That ends Chapter 9. I really like this book, Brian Kellow, Pauline Kael, A Life in the Dark. It is a biography, but it's also a lot about her ideas and opinions. So if you like Pauline, I would recommend that. I'll close and recommend a YouTube channel. It's called Movie Wise, Movie W-I-S-E. It has some very interesting video essays. I think maybe he does 1 a month, 2 a month, something like that. But give that a shot. And I will also say thank you for listening. And happy autumn.